The Economist magazine called Taiwan the most dangerous place on Earth. That was not hyperbole. Taiwan sits at the intersection of every major tension in the modern world. The rivalry between the United States and China, the struggle between democracy and authoritarianism, the competition for technological supremacy. But what makes Taiwan uniquely dangerous is not ideology. It is economics. Taiwan produces over 90% of the world's most advanced semiconductors. These are not ordinary computer chips. These are the chips that power artificial intelligence, advanced weapon systems, 5G networks, and virtually every piece of sophisticated technology on the planet. One company, Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company, TSMC, produces the vast majority of these chips. There is no alternative. There is no backup. The fabs that produce these chips took decades to build and cannot be replicated quickly. If Taiwan's chip production stopped tomorrow, the global economy would enter a crisis unlike anything we have experienced in our lifetimes. Now consider that China has massed the largest amphibious invasion force assembled since World War II, that Chinese military exercises increasingly simulate blockades and landings on Taiwan, that Xi Jinping has tied his legacy to reunification and has declined to rule out force. This is not a distant hypothetical. This is a scenario that Pentagon planners, insurance companies, and central banks are actively preparing for. And yet, most investors have no idea how exposed they are. To understand why Taiwan is so important, you need to understand what semiconductors actually are. Semiconductors are not just components in electronics. They are the foundation of modern civilization. Every computer, every phone, every car, every appliance, every medical device, every weapon system, every financial transaction, all of them depend on chips. The global semiconductor industry produces about $600 billion worth of chips annually, but those chips enable over $50 trillion in economic activity. The leverage is almost incomprehensible, and Taiwan dominates this industry in a way that no country has ever dominated any critical supply chain. TSMC alone manufactures over 50% of all semiconductors worldwide. For the most advanced chips, the ones measured in nanometers, the ones that power AI and military systems, TSMC's share is over 90%. Samsung in South Korea makes some advanced chips. Intel in the United States is trying to catch up, but right now, today, there is no alternative to Taiwan. This happened by design. Taiwan, a small island with few natural resources and a giant hostile neighbor, made a strategic decision decades ago. Become so essential to the global economy that the world cannot afford to let you fall. This strategy has a name, the Silicon Shield. The theory is simple. If Taiwan makes the chips that everyone needs, then everyone has an interest in protecting Taiwan. An attack on Taiwan becomes an attack on the global supply chain. The cost of invasion becomes not just military, but economic, affecting every country on Earth. The Silicon Shield has worked brilliantly. For decades, it has given Taiwan a form of protection that no military alliance could match. But shields can be broken, and the consequences of breaking this one would be catastrophic. Here is something that should terrify every investor. The entire modern economy depends on a handful of buildings on an island that China claims as its territory. TSMC's most advanced fabs are concentrated in a few locations in Taiwan, the Fab 18 complex in Tainan, the facilities in Hsinchu Science Park, a few other sites. These are not just factories. They are the most sophisticated manufacturing facilities ever built by human beings. The machines inside them cost hundreds of millions of dollars each. The processes they use are so precise that a speck of dust can ruin a production run. These facilities took 30 years and hundreds of billions of dollars to build. The knowledge to operate them exists in the heads of thousands of highly trained Taiwanese engineers. You cannot move this capacity. You cannot quickly replicate it. You cannot replace it. If these facilities were destroyed by missiles, by bombs, by sabotage, the global economy would lose access to the chips it needs to function. Not for weeks, for years. Intel is building new fabs in the United States. TSMC is building a fab in Arizona. Samsung is expanding in Texas. But these projects will take years to complete and will not match Taiwan's capacity or capability for at least a decade. For the foreseeable future, the world depends on Taiwan. There is no plan B. China's position on Taiwan is not ambiguous. The Chinese Communist Party considers Taiwan a breakaway province that must eventually be reunified with the mainland. This is not negotiable. This is not rhetorical. This is a core principle of CCP legitimacy. For decades, China was content to wait. The official policy was peaceful reunification, the hope that Taiwan would eventually agree to rejoin China voluntarily, perhaps under a one-country, two-systems arrangement like Hong Kong. That hope is now dead. After watching what happened to Hong Kong, the crackdown on protests, the end of democratic freedoms, the imprisonment of dissidents, the Taiwanese people have no interest in reunification. Polls show that Taiwanese identity has surged, especially among young people. The idea of becoming part of the People's Republic is increasingly unthinkable. This leaves China with a problem. Peaceful reunification is impossible. But reunification must happen. Xi Jinping has said so repeatedly. He has tied his legacy to it. That leaves force. Xi has ordered the People's Liberation Army to be ready to take Taiwan by 2027. This does not mean an invasion will happen in 2027, but it means the capability will exist. The option will be on the table. And every year, that option looks more viable. Scenario 1, the blockade. The most likely scenario is not an invasion. It is a blockade. Taiwan is an island. It imports 98% of its energy. It imports most of its food. It depends entirely on maritime shipping for survival. China could, with relatively little military risk, simply surround Taiwan with ships, not firing a shot, just preventing anything from going in or out. This would be presented not as an act of war, but as a customs enforcement action. China would claim it is merely enforcing its sovereignty over what it considers Chinese territory. The legal and diplomatic situation would be murky. Is this an act of war? Does the United States have an obligation to respond? How do you break a blockade without starting a larger conflict? While diplomats debated, Taiwan would begin to starve. Within weeks, fuel shortages would cripple the economy. Within months, food supplies would run out. And here is the critical point: the chip fabs would stop. Semiconductor manufacturing requires constant supplies of specialized chemicals, gases, and materials. These come from all over the world and must be delivered continuously. A blockade would halt production within days. For your portfolio, a blockade scenario would trigger immediate chaos. Semiconductor stocks would collapse, then spike on scarcity fears, then collapse again on demand destruction. Every company that depends on chips, which is every company, would face a supply chain disruption. Defense stocks would surge, oil prices would spike, shipping costs would explode, insurance rates for Asia-Pacific routes would become prohibitive. The Federal Reserve would face an impossible choice: raise rates to fight the inflation caused by supply shocks, or cut rates to fight the recession caused by economic disruption. Markets hate uncertainty. A blockade would create maximum uncertainty with no clear resolution in sight. Scenario 2, the invasion. An actual military invasion would be far worse. China has been building the capability to invade Taiwan for decades. The PLA Navy now has more ships than the US Navy. China has developed massive amphibious assault ships, thousands of landing craft, and the logistics to move hundreds of thousands of troops across the Taiwan Strait. An invasion would be the largest amphibious operation in history, dwarfing D-Day. It would involve missile barrages, air superiority battles, naval combat, and urban warfare in some of the most densely populated areas on Earth. Taiwan would fight. The island is a natural fortress. Mountainous terrain, dense cities, a population motivated to resist. The United States would likely intervene in some form, though the extent is uncertain. The war would not be quick. It would not be clean. And the economic consequences would be catastrophic. The chip fabs would be destroyed. Whether by Chinese missiles, Taiwanese scorched earth tactics, or American strikes to prevent the technology from falling into Chinese hands, the fabs would not survive. The Taiwan Strait would become a war zone. 30% of global shipping passes through these waters. That shipping would stop. Insurance markets would freeze. Lloyd's of London has already indicated that Taiwan conflict would trigger exclusion clauses. Ships would not sail without insurance. Trade would halt. Financial markets would experience dislocations we have not seen since 1929. The interconnected nature of modern finance means that failures would cascade. Banks would fail. Funds would freeze. The phrase, too big to fail, would be tested in ways we cannot imagine. For your portfolio, an invasion scenario is not a bear market. It is a financial extinction event. Scenario 3, the aftermath. But here is what most people do not think about. Even if the war ends quickly, the economic damage lasts for years. Let us say China takes Taiwan in 6 months. The fighting stops. The world adjusts to a new reality. The chip fabs are gone. Advanced semiconductor production has effectively ended. The world must rebuild this capacity from scratch. How long does that take? Optimistically, 5 years. Realistically, a decade. During that decade, there are not enough chips. Every industry that depends on advanced semiconductors, which is increasingly every industry, operates in shortage mode. New cars cannot be built. Data centers cannot be expanded. AI development stalls. Medical devices are rationed. Military systems cannot be replaced. The economic cost has been estimated at over $2 trillion in the first year alone. The long-term cost is incalculable. And this assumes the conflict stays contained. If the United States and China engage directly, we are talking about a war between nuclear powers. The economic modeling becomes irrelevant because the scenarios become existential. Let me be specific about what is at risk in your portfolio. If you own broad market index funds, S&P 500 total market funds, you are heavily exposed. Technology stocks make up nearly 30% of the S&P 500. These companies depend on Taiwan for chips. Apple sources virtually all of its advanced processors from TSMC. NVIDIA designs chips that TSMC manufactures. AMD, Qualcomm, Broadcom, all fabless companies that depend on Taiwanese manufacturing. But it is not just tech. Automakers depend on chips. Banks depend on data centers that depend on chips. Retailers depend on logistics systems that depend on chips. Healthcare depends on medical devices that depend on chips. The exposure is not in your technology allocation. The exposure is everywhere. International diversification does not help as much as you might think. European and Asian markets are equally dependent on Taiwanese chips. In fact, export-dependent economies like Germany, Japan, and South Korea would be hit even harder than the United States. Even bonds are not safe. A Taiwan conflict would create inflationary shocks that would devastate bond prices. The flight to safety would be chaotic, and the safe assets might not be safe at all. Real estate would face a complex picture. Domestic properties might hold value, but commercial real estate dependent on supply chains would suffer. Mortgage markets could freeze if banking systems destabilize. Gold and commodities would likely spike, but accessing those gains during a financial crisis is not straightforward. Markets might close. Exchanges might freeze. Liquidity might disappear. Institutional investors are not ignoring this risk. They are quietly repositioning. Major funds have been reducing concentration in companies with high Taiwan exposure. This is not publicized. Large institutions do not announce moves that could move markets, but the flow data shows it. Defense contractors have seen steady institutional accumulation. Companies like Lockheed Martin, Raytheon, Northrop Grumman, and General Dynamics benefit from any scenario that increases geopolitical tension. Domestic semiconductor investment is accelerating. The CHIPS Act in the United States is funneling billions into domestic production. Companies building fabs in America, Intel, TSMC's Arizona facility, Samsung's Texas facility, are receiving significant investment interest. Supply chain diversification is a major theme. Companies that help move production out of China and Taiwan, logistics firms, automation companies, manufacturing consultancies are seen as beneficiaries. Energy independence plays are gaining attention. Companies involved in domestic energy production, nuclear power, and energy storage are seen as hedges against supply disruptions. But here's the truth. There is no perfect hedge against this risk. The scenario is too large, too interconnected, too unprecedented. The best institutional investors can do is reduce exposure and increase resilience. Individual investors can do the same, but they should be realistic about what is possible. So what should you actually do? First, understand your exposure. Look at your portfolio and identify how much depends on the Taiwan supply chain. This is harder than it sounds because the dependencies are indirect, but a rough assessment is better than ignorance. Second, consider diversification beyond equities. In a true crisis scenario, correlations go to 1. Everything falls together. But some assets fall less than others. Cash, short-term treasuries, and physical assets provide some buffer. Third, think about liquidity. In a crisis, the ability to access your money matters as much as the value of your money. Having cash reserves, avoiding concentrated positions that are hard to sell, and staying away from illiquid investments all increase resilience. Fourth, consider your time horizon. If you're 20 years from retirement, a Taiwan crisis would be devastating but recoverable. If you are 5 years from retirement, you have much less room for recovery. Fifth, do not panic. The probability of a Taiwan invasion in any given year is not high. It is not 50%. It is probably not even 20%, but it is not zero. And the consequences are severe enough that even a small probability demands attention. The goal is not to predict the future. The goal is to build a portfolio that survives multiple futures, including the worst ones. But I want to be honest with you about something. Some risks cannot be hedged. A full-scale war between the United States and China over Taiwan is one of them. In that scenario, financial planning becomes secondary to basic survival. Supply chains collapse. Essential goods become scarce. The financial system may cease to function in recognizable ways. This is not a scenario you can portfolio optimize your way out of. It is a scenario where different preparations matter. Community, skills, physical resilience. I'm not saying you should become a prepper. I'm saying that there are limits to what financial instruments can protect against. The best case for Taiwan is that it never happens. That deterrence holds, that cooler heads prevail, that the economic interdependence between the United States and China makes war too costly for either side. This is probably the most likely outcome. Wars that everyone expects often do not happen because everyone prepares for them, but probably is not certainly, and the consequences of being wrong are too severe to ignore entirely. There's a question I keep coming back to when I think about Taiwan. We have built a global economy of extraordinary efficiency, supply chains that span continents, just-in-time manufacturing that eliminates waste, concentration of production in the places that do it best. This system has made everything cheaper. It has lifted billions out of poverty. It has given ordinary people access to technology that would have seemed like magic a generation ago. But efficiency has a cost, fragility. We have optimized for normal times. We have not prepared for abnormal times. We have built a system that works beautifully when nothing goes wrong and catastrophically when something does. Taiwan is the single point of failure in this system. One island, one company, one technology that the entire world depends on and cannot replace. This is not Taiwan's fault. Taiwan did what small countries do. It found a niche and exploited it brilliantly. The Silicon Shield was a rational strategy for a nation in an impossible position. The fault lies with the rest of us, with companies that optimized for cost without considering risk, with governments that allowed critical infrastructure to concentrate in vulnerable locations, with investors who priced in efficiency gains without pricing in catastrophic downside. We are all exposed to Taiwan. Every retirement account, every pension fund, every sovereign wealth fund. The exposure is hidden in supply chains and dependencies that most people never think about. The Taiwan situation may resolve peacefully. China may decide that the costs of invasion are too high. Deterrence may hold for another generation, long enough for supply chains to diversify and alternatives to emerge. But it may not. And if it does not, the question will not be what happened to your portfolio. The question will be what happened to the system we all depend on. The answer will be, we knew the risk. We saw it clearly. We talked about it in conferences and reports and videos like this one, and we did not fix it in time. I hope I am wrong. I hope this video ages badly. I hope that in 10 years, the Taiwan crisis will be a historical footnote, a risk that never materialized, a bullet that the world dodged. But hope is not a strategy, and the time to prepare is before the crisis, not after. Look at your portfolio, understand your exposure, make whatever adjustments make sense for your situation, and then hope, as I do, that you never need them.